Hello, my name is Simon Mature, Nutanix Technical SE. Today I'm going to take you through a demo of Nutanix Prism and Prism Central with a focus on virtual machine data protection and disaster recovery. So with that said, let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get into it. So first, what I'd like to do is show you a little bit about the environment that we have. I have two clusters set up with Nutanix Central pane of management that we call Prism Central. If I look at the first cluster here, you'll see the name of the cluster is NFIL 001, and it is currently running our Acropolis hypervisor. In addition to that, if I click this other tab over here, you'll see that I have another cluster set up. We call this NFIL 002, also running Acropolis hypervisor. Nutanix does support other hypervisors such as VMware ESXi and Microsoft Hyper-V, but today this demonstration is going to focus on the Nutanix hypervisor AHV. In addition to that, we have our central pane of glass that we call Prism Central. So I'll be showing you a little bit back and forth through a couple of these different console screens to make some points. First, starting off here in the main screen. So one of the things that I want to show you here about hyperconverged infrastructure, a little bit about the hardware itself. And here we have, within this particular cluster, we have 4 hosts. And you can see the IP addresses, the Nutanix CVM, you see the hypervisor that's running on these hosts. In addition to that, we have a visualization screen. And in this diagram screen, I can see different things about the environment. If I click on one of the nodes and scroll down here, again, I can see the IP information. I can see the name of the host, as well as some analytics around host performance, host usage, any alerts and events that may have occurred on that particular host. I can do the same thing with any of the local disks that are attached to these particular nodes. Again, I can get disk usage or disk performance, again, any disk alerts. I can turn LEDs on or off if I need to replace a disk drive and send a field engineer into a data center if we need to ever replace drives. Again, here, clicking on one of the drives, we can see what type of drive it is. In this case, it's an NVMe drive. And we can do various different things with the host. We have different actions down here, as well as turning on and off LEDs. We can enter the host in maintenance mode. We can repair or reboot the host, and we have the ability to remove hosts from the cluster or add them. So hyperconverged infrastructure is very similar to a Lego building block concept, where we can easily add nodes to a cluster or remove nodes from a cluster. And one of the things that you'll notice, first we've talked about the hardware and we've talked about the compute. Now if I go into the storage, you can see that all of the 24 disk drives across all those 4 hosts form a single storage pool with 23 terabytes of what you might refer to as raw storage. And so what we do with hyperconverged infrastructure with Nutanix, we take all the local attached drives, combine them into a single happy storage pool, and we use that storage pool for things like shared storage so that we can do things like high availability and we can fill VMs from one host to another, or so that we can do things like live move a VM from one node to another. VMware would call their terminology vMotion, if you're familiar with that. With our technology, with our hypervisor, we do the same thing. We just use a different name and we call it migrating a VM from one node to another. And if you look over here, when I click on storage container, this is a logical grouping into which we put virtual machines. And in here, we can actually do what we call either redundancy factor RF2, or we can do RF3, and you'll notice that the maximum usable is half of the raw. So when we're doing RF2, the usable space is half the raw. I can come into one of these containers and I can go to the advanced settings, and you can see that this is where we can do things like reserving capacity, advertising different capacity. This is where we enable compression. We do both inline and post-process compression, as well as the ability to enable erasure coding, if we like, on these particular storage containers. And I can add a storage container at any time, add new ones, to which I would put VMs in. And so you can see I might have more than one storage container where I've applied different attributes, different levels of, say, replication factors, compression, dedupe, and or et cetera, right? And so if I go back here to hardware and I look here, just want to make sure that I've shown you some of the analytics here. Again, I think I covered this, but host performance, host usage, this is in real time. We're going to look at some more of this. And then, of course, if I click the disks, I have the same capabilities. So from a hardware perspective, we have centralized the hardware management of both the compute and the storage into a central pane of glass, reducing complexity. Think of a customer, for example, who might have Dell for their compute, and maybe they have NetApp for external storage. We've just combined this capability of managing compute and storage into a central console here. So one of the things that I do want to show you before we move on is when we think about hybrid converged infrastructure at Nutanix, we do support multiple different hardware manufacturers. We have our own branded model we refer to as our NX, and we have various different models, different form factors such as 1U, 2U. Some of the models have multiple nodes in the 2U chassis. Some of the nodes are designed for data center, some are designed for remote office. Some can do all SSD, some can do hard drives. We might call that a hybrid node where it's got a mix of spinning disk and all flash. And then, of course, some of the models are, all SSD or all NVMe. As well as supporting our Nutanix branded, we do support multiple other hardware manufacturers such as Cisco. All the Cisco nodes begin with HCIA, and they're typically either the Cisco M6 or M7 series. In addition to Cisco, we support many others like Dell. All the Dell nodes typically begin with XC. We refer to them as the XC series. Again, different models, different form factors, depending on needs and requirements. Another popular one would be from HPE. Typically the DX, ProLiant DX series. Again, you can see multiple different models available. For example, 325, 360. I've sold many customers have chosen the HPE model that I've worked with quite a lot. We also support manufacturers like Lenovo. All the Lenovo models begin with HX. Again, different form factors, different models. As well as, for example, not only do we have the ability to store to run Nutanix on hardware for on-prem, we do have the ability to run Nutanix in the cloud in AWS. When we run in AWS, we're typically running on what AWS calls their bare metal nodes. For example, this i3 EN metal or this M5D metal node, and we run our software on those AWS bare metal nodes. In addition to AWS, we also support Microsoft Azure, and we can run on either this AN36 or AN36P model. So with that, let me also show you Prism Central. This is our main pane of glass, where from here we can actually see both consoles. So jumping back to the main Prism element, again, this is the cluster this is the console for the one cluster that we call NFIL 001. If I come to this tab, this is the main console just for the cluster that we call NFIL 002. And then, of course, we do have our central manager of managers screen that we call Prism Central, which just allows us to manage all clusters regardless of geographic location from a central pane of glass. So all of these clusters that I've reserved for this demonstration happen to be in Durham, North Carolina. I'm actually accessing them remotely from my home lab in Southern Maryland. But this could be a Prism Central that's managing United States, East Coast, West Coast clusters. It could manage EMEA, Asia, et cetera. Doesn't really matter, but Prism Central is the manager of managers. So if I look at this cluster, one of the things that I'd like to show you is we've shown you a little bit about the hardware from both the compute and the storage. And now I'd like to focus a little bit on virtual machines. Here you can see a list of all the VMs. Some are running, some are not. There's different pages of VMs. I also have a capability to search in the search field here, so I can search for different VMs. And I have the ability to create a new VM from, this is one way to do it. There's another way to do it in Prism Central, which I'll show you in just a bit. So we can give the VM a name, and we can add our virtual resources for virtual CPU, a number of cores per CPU, how much virtual memory do we want to have, and we can add virtual disks. We can allocate the disks, or we can even clone from our image service. On our image service, we may have pre-uploaded different disks that might already contain operating systems and applications, such as a domain controller, a Linux virtual machine, a utility such as Nutanix Move, a database, or even things like Windows 10 or Windows 2012. And so we can easily just go ahead and add a disk to a VM when we're creating that VM. And then of course we can do things like adding virtual network interface cards. We might have multiple different subnets. We can go ahead and add whichever subnet that we need to add. We can add affinity rules and even custom scripts. I'm going to bypass this. I'm not going to go ahead and create one here. We could do that more detailed if somebody wanted to do a boot camp. But for today, I just wanted to show you that this is the straight and easy way to create a VM. Later on, I'll show you through Prism Central how we do the same with templates. So not only that, I do have the ability, as I said, to look through this list of VMs, or I can search in here, and I'm going to type in my name, Simon, because I've got several virtual machines that begin with my name, and I want to show you all of those. So if I click one of these, such as this one called VM-Simon1, and I scroll down, you can see all the information, like what host is it on? Well, it's on NFIL cluster 1, and it's on host 1 of 4. I can see the host IP, and then I see all this virtual machine resources. So you saw the same type of information earlier on both the compute and the storage, and now you're looking at the same time a real-time analytics, but this time based on a VM performance. So we have things like CPU, memory, controller IOPS, and so on and so forth here as far as bandwidth and latency. And I can also see however many virtual disks I have. If this is a database VM, certainly I'd have many more B disks. I can see the virtual NICs. If we're taking any local snapshots, if there's any tasks. And then of course we have this IO metrics, which gets pretty darn interesting, especially if we end up having a database where we're doing either random or sequential IOPS. This screenshot would show, not screenshot, this view would show us all of that information for that particular virtual machine, especially useful if it's a database. And you'll notice down here, while I've selected one of the VMs, I have various different tasks I can do. We can manage our guest tools, just like VMware. We have a Nutanix guest tool. Our guest tool allows us to do things like cross-hypervisor replication, to replicate from a Nutanix cluster running VMware ESXi to another Nutanix cluster running a different hypervisor like Nutanix AHV. And so we install our guest tools to be able to facilitate that. While I've selected the VM, I can do things like launch the console. Certainly you can, but you can obviously connect in through this console as well, which makes life very nice and easy. I'm not going to bother to log out. I'm just going to close the screen because I might want to use that later on. And then of course I have power on, power off, guest reboot, guest proper shutdown. I can take snapshots, I can clone, and I can migrate. I can even update this virtual machine. So in the same way that I showed you how to create a VM, if I click update, I've got all the capability in here if I wanted to change some of the things such as the virtual CPU, the memory, adding a disk, adding a virtual CD, etc. I can also migrate. Before I migrate, I want to show you again, keep in mind, this VM is on node 1 of 4. You can see in the 1-1. So if I say migrate, you might be familiar with VMware vMotion. This is very similar to that. So I'm going to go ahead and not do automatic. I'm going to choose node number 4, and I'm going to say migrate. And one of the things that we see when we do that is we see a task running, right? Now, when I click on the task, I can actually see what's running. I've got a migrate task happening, and it just succeeded. And when I select the virtual machine and I come back down here and I look, I can see not only what host it's on, I can see that this is now on host number 4, right? And that's designated both here in this main screen where it shows me the host, as well as down here in the detailed information as well. And so there's a lot of information that I can do. I can even clone the VM. So one of the things that I might want to be able to do is, take a snapshot or a clone. And when we take a snapshot, we are a little bit different than VMware. VMware typically uses a copy on write technology for snapshots, and that typically creates one single chain that becomes very problematic when you're trying to manage snapshots, especially if the primary VM gets deleted, right? And so what we can do with snapshots is we do not use copy on write. We use a technology called redirect on write. What that means is each snapshot has its own separate metadata. It's not a chain. And so what that means is even if we delete the primary VM, the rest of the snapshots are available from which I can actually create clones. So I'm actually going to show you how I can create a clone here. I can choose any number of clones. It could be 100, 1,000, whatever. I can have a starting index number. I can say, for example, what is the prefix? And this VM is Simon-1. And I'm actually going to call this clone. And I'm going to start it with 1, and it's going to go to 5. I could, if I wanted to, change any of the virtual information, such as amount of allocated CPU, memory, storage, disk, etc. I could run custom scripts. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. We've received that option to go ahead and do that clone procedure for the 5 VMs. And you can see, lo and behold, they were created. Now, they're not powered on in this instance. I'm not using the automation right now. I'm using the manual information. And so now I could do things like power on this VM, right? And once that virtual machine is powered on, I'm going to just switch views right here real quick to take a look at this, maybe refresh the screen a little bit. And after it's powered on, which it is here, you'll notice that the launch console is now available. I can launch the console. I can see that VM booting up, and I can get to the point that I can log in or do whatever I might need to do to that VM. So I'm just going to go ahead, and since I don't need it, I'm going to go ahead and power off that virtual machine, and we can do some other things with it a little bit later on. So now what I'm going to do is go back to Prism Central. And if I come here and I look at the virtual machines here, again, in this screen, I can filter and type Simon, and I can see all the various different VMs. So I see my original VM, it's called VM Simon 1, and I see all of these different clones here. And you notice that I can select multiple VMs from my central pane of glass that we call Prism Central. So while I'm showing you some of the things on the console GUI for an individual cluster, the point is that the central management cluster, Prism Central, allows you to do so much more across multiple clusters all at the same time. And we do find that most customers do all of their work in Prism Central. And so one of the things that I can do here is some of the actions. I can do things like delete, I can power on. I can install our guest tools that I talked about earlier. So in this case, for example, let me deselect all of them. And well, actually, what I wanted to show you is just launching the console and doing some of the things that we've done from the main screen. So if I just select this one, for example, and I say launch console, I'm doing the same thing that I did earlier, but now I'm doing it from the Prism console screen as opposed to doing it from the individual console of an individual cluster. So just showing you the ability for the central management to do the same thing, but across multiple VMs, across multiple different locations. And then the ability to manage multiple VMs at the same time, doing things like powering them all on together instead of one at a time, powering them all off together instead of one at a time. Or what I'm going to do in this case, because I don't need these VMs, is I'm just going to go ahead and delete them all. And so if I click this button, and again, we show, tasks are running. We always show the tasks that are running, and then we can see once that has succeeded, then we can go back to the actual VMs, and we can see that those VMs are now gone, especially if I type in my filter. Now we see that those clone ones are gone. So one of the other things that I want to show you is not only that, but we do have, where's VMs? Here it is, templates. So not only can I manually create a VM, so I can certainly do that here. From Prism Central, I can say create a VM, give it a name, assign it to whichever cluster I want. Maybe I want it to be on cluster 1 as opposed to cluster 2. And then, of course, I have the number of VMs that I want to deploy. It could be more than one. What are some of the resources that I want? I can call it something like this, create 10 of them. And I might do some dashes. I don't like to have spaces. I'm just going to take all this out and say test just on PC, that kind of thing, right? So if I wanted to, I could go ahead and create 5. I could attach various different disks. Again, we could clone from our image service. If we've got that available, I could allocate on storage. I could create a new one, make it, 100 gig or whatever size that I want, hit save as far as the disk. And then I have the ability to do any customization if I want, so just sysprep, et cetera, changing time zone. And then of course, what I can do is say create VM. I'm not going to do that in this case because I've shown you creating a VM from the main console, but this is the same idea, but doing it from Prism Central. So I'm just going to discard that. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on showing you templates because I think that's more important. And so I can come in here to the template. I've actually created one already, and I can update the configuration, show you that, and say, I've got this initial version, and I've started out with 2 vCPUs, 2 cores, 2 memory. I can obviously change that. I can allocate disks, virtual CD. I can allocate virtual network, VLANs. And then, of course, again, I can add my customization, right? And anything that I might want to change. So this would be the idea of taking the existing template and updating it. I don't need to update it. So again, I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel out of that. But what I am going to do is go ahead and deploy VM. So I'm going to call it VM template my name. And I'm going to do, I don't know, some number 5 of them. And starting index, we're going to call it 1, right? So if I say next, it's going to deploy this with these features. And again, in this case, notice no customization. In other words, no sysprep. I chose to do that with the template. Obviously, if you did want to do customization or run a script, run sysprep, you would obviously modify your template so that your template does include all of the things that you want done. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and click deploy. And again, that says that was already successful. So I can go back and look at the VMs. And in this case, I think I didn't use my name. I think I just used SM. So we can see these VMs coming in here, 1, 2, 3. And what I can do is just go back here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and go to summary, go to list. And here's the VMs that I've just created. And actually, instead of typing that, how about I type in template? Yep, there we go. All right. And this one is coming in, it just hasn't quite got named correctly. So I was basically trying to refresh my screen by clicking on something else and coming back. There it is. So now we see all 5 VMs. There's obviously a timeout for an automated refresh. I'm just hurrying up to do that. So again, I can take these VMs and I can do things like power them on. Let me just select one of them and go ahead and power it on, show you that you can log into it, that kind of thing. Once it's powered on, we'll have the launch console available to us. Right now it's grayed out because it wasn't powered on yet. And if I'm patient and wait, which I tend not to be patient, and I tend to like to go as quick as I can, but there we go. Now we should be able to launch the console and get into that VM that we just created from the template, and we can see that it's spinning up and Windows operating system is booting. A lot of you guys probably gonna kill me for this, but look, this is just demo. So I'm just gonna go ahead and power this off. I really don't care about this VM. And then what I'm gonna do is select all of these VMs, and I'm gonna go ahead and just delete them to clean up. All right. And then, of course, we have all the task details that we can look at. You can see different things here like updating VMs, creating VMs, changing the power state, cloning the VMs, all the different tasks that we did, like launching the console, and so on and so forth, right? So I've shown you a lot so far. We did cloning of VMs, we powered on VMs, we launched the console, we deleted some clones, we did some templates. We showed the ability to update the template and select and deploy VMs from the template. So now if I go, and this is all done from Prism Central, now if I go to our Prism element screen and I get rid of this filter that says Simon, And you can see that these are in alphabetical order. If I go to the next page, currently in the P's, I don't have anything that begins with T for template. So, all of those VMs are gone, and we saw that represented in the task view as well. So a lot that you can do with VMs with the Acropolis hypervisor, a lot of the activities that I just tried to show you, tried to be as representative as I could of what you might be coming from, typically from a VMware vSphere with ESXi environment, and trying to show you all those similar capabilities. So now I'd like to quickly move into health. This is our health screen. This is your typical red light, green light. What's going on in the environment. I can look at things like VMs. I can sort them by hosts if I want to. And I have the ability to look at all the different hosts and group them and see if there's anything that's red light that I might need to take care of, all the disks in the environment, all the different storage pools. And remember, I only have one storage pool that contains all the disks, but I do have multiple storage containers into which VMs reside that I apply attributes like compression, deduplication, erasure coding. I have protection domains where I'm going to show you in a bit how we do protection of VMs, how we replicate from one site to another, do snapshots, and protect those VMs. And then, of course, we can connect one cluster to another. We call that remote site, so we want to make sure that the replication and the connection is okay. And then we have services. Is there anything that's wrong? But you'll notice on the right-hand side, we have all these various different checks that are going on. We actually do hundreds of checks in the environment, and we're doing them periodically just to make sure that everything is okay. And so what might draw your eye and your attention to something that's failed. And so you want to know what's failed in the environment, and you want to take action. If I click on it, I'll see a typical thing, which is not really a big deal because this is a lab. My CVM, which is a controller virtual machine, is still using the default password, and obviously best practices recommendations are to change the default password to something else. But one of the things that you can see is if we go back here to all of the entities and I show you all these different checks, if I search for one of them, for example, I'm going to search for power. And I might have a case where one of the nodes has a bad power supply that needs to be replaced. We typically would automatically detect that fault. We would typically automatically open a support case, assign an SRE, get a power supply delivered, and decide whether you want our engineer to come on site to do the replacement, or if you want to do the replacement, we can do it either way. But while you're waiting for that power supply to show up, could typically be next day, we may want to turn that check off so that we don't keep getting notified. Or we might want to reduce the criticality of that alert, or we might want to change the frequency of how frequently Nutanix checks to see if the power supply is good or not, from maybe once every hour to something like maybe once every 8 hours or once a day, just until I get that installed. Another example of that might be, I've seen obviously a bad NIC go down, so I could do the same thing if a NIC is not failing. Or another one that I've seen is typically NTP. We do require timed services, and sometimes I've seen where customers' NTP doesn't run, or the CVMs, for whatever reason, cannot connect to your NTP server. In this case, everything's okay. And one of the things that you will notice about all of our alert notification is we always tell you the cause of the failure. We try to give you a root cause. We try to give you recommended resolution. And if need be, we'll give you a link to a KB article on how to resolve that. So a lot that we do typically with our health dashboard. And so we're constantly, as a friendly reminder, looking at all of the environment and the health check environment. We're looking at, excuse me, let me take this off. We're looking at all these different checks from the CVM, from the hosts, from the network. There's literally hundreds of checks that we look at, and we're looking at them constantly with various different schedules, depending on what the check is for, right? Just to make sure that the environment is doing okay. There's a lot of other things that we can look at, but next, what I think I'd like to do is focus on our data protection. And this is a basic data protection. This is how we actually protect virtual machines with the ability to take snapshots locally, replicate these snapshots to another site. I would typically call this data protection kind of like a backup. In a few minutes after I do this, I'll then show you our disaster recovery and our automated disaster recovery. capability, and we'll do that through Prism Central so that you can see some of the differences. Here, what I'm going to do is show you some of the basic capabilities of how we set up data protection. And the first thing would be is to set up a remote site. A remote site is when we have more than one cluster, we're replicating. And if I click this button up here, you'll notice that I can either do another physical cluster or I can actually do the cloud. So we actually have the ability, if I wanted to set this up, to replicate out to AWS and or Azure. Or I just simply say that I'm replicating to another cloud, and I would give it all the virtual information, such as this one that I did here, where I said, okay, my source cluster NFIL1 is replicating to NFIL2, and I just have to give it the virtual cluster IP information, as well as what we call vStore mapping, where I say, you know, I want the images from this vStore to be replicated to this other one. Think about when I talked about containers. So I might have multiple different connections. And then what we have is what we call our protection domain. This is where we actually put the VMs, and we select the VMs that we want protected, and we select the schedule. So if I come in here, on the left-hand side would be the list of all the VMs that are available in that cluster, and I can use consistency groups. I can take application level consistent snapshots. If I click this button here, it moves these VMs to the right-hand side. Anything on the right-hand side would be the ones that I've chosen to be protected in this protection domain, as well as here's my schedule. I can update the schedule and show you the frequency. You can do a grandfather, father, son, where you have multiple schedules, where you're doing, you know, dailies, weeklies, monthlies, etc. I've chosen 15 minutes. And one of the things that you can do is go as granular as every 1 minute with our technology at Nutanix through a technology that we call near sync. And so you notice that it says enter a value that's greater than 0. So if I wanted to, I could simply do 1, but I'm going to leave it at 15. And then, of course, I can choose my retention, or both the local site, the local cluster, as well as the target cluster, in this case, NFIL2. And I can have different number of retention and decide when I want that process to start. So I'm going to cancel out of that because I don't need to make any changes. But obviously, if I scroll down here, one of the things that you'll notice, because I'm replicating, you'll see the replication, you'll see the outgoing. And actually, if I were to go to the incoming site, this is the other site, this is the other cluster. And if I go to data protection here, and I go to async, you'll actually see the incoming replication. So you notice that the protection domain is replicating from cluster 1 to cluster 2, and this shows me the incoming replication. I'm going to click back on cluster 1. This is the outgoing replication. It also shows me the entities. What VMs have I chosen? What's my schedule? How frequently do I want to do that? What kind of local snapshots am I retaining on this local cluster? And where are my remote snapshots? And one of the things that's pretty neat here is I can take all these local snapshots and I can do a restore. And so I can pick any of these VMs, and I can either overwrite or I can create a new clone from that snapshot that I talked about earlier. I won't do that today. If somebody wants to see more granular, we can set up a boot camp and spend more time on it. In addition, I have the capability to do the same thing and retrieve the snapshot from the local site, from the replicated site, and update things in that manner as well. So a lot of capabilities to understand, obviously, if there's any alerts, events, if there was any metrics that needed to be managed, I have the ability to do that, as well as the ability that I mentioned to restore either locally or remotely. And then, of course, the same thing here. I've just flipped over to the second cluster. And if I look at the snapshots, these are the ones that are local to this particular cluster, and I can do a restore over there. And I can do that, and I'm just going to load that. And I'm going to go back over here, and then I'm going to go back here. Okay, so a lot of capabilities to do snapshots. And we'll show you a little bit more automation with our disaster recovery capabilities and automation in Prism Central in just a few minutes. But before I do that, I want to show you a few things more in this screen. We do have the analytics here. And analytics are more real-time analytics of what's going on from different perspectives of either the hosts, the storage, the virtual machines. and you can choose just about any metric that you want. In this case, I've chosen disk read IOPS, and I've chosen disk write IOPS from this server NFI, from this cluster NFIL01. I've also chosen CPU utilization, hypervisor CPU utilization on NFIL1 and NFIL2 on those two hosts, as well as write IOPS on host 4. And so the way that you do that is just choose either a new metric or a new entity. You can choose whether you're looking at things from the perspective of a host, a cluster, a storage pool, a virtual machine. And then once you've chosen whatever entity, there's going to be a ton of different things that you might want to look at. For example, it could be metrics that are available here, such as write IOPS, right? So a lot of different things that I can choose. I can choose this particular cluster, so that I want to use write IOPS, give it a name. I'm going to cancel out because I've just chosen a bunch of them here to show you. And this is looking at in real time, over time, and stores data for, I believe it's 180 days. And now what I can, and Prism Central stores data for like a year. So all of this data on this cluster rolls up to Prism Central for further analysis. So one of the things I can do is move this slide bar. And as I do, I might slide it over to where I see a peak in one of the things that's going on in the environment. That might correlate to an event. And then what you might see is if there is an alert, that alert would show up on the right-hand side with root cause analysis, as well as typically a link to the support portal for remediation instructions on what I might need to do in that environment to say, you know, I saw this peak, here's what happened, and here's when it happened, and help me to troubleshoot. So a lot of times in your environment, you're probably using multiple tools, and we're consolidating those tools for compute, storage, hypervisor, virtual machine, hardware, software, all into a central pane of glass, and helping you to understand, making sure that the environment is healthy. If there is something that went wrong, we're helping you to diagnose when that happened. In addition to that, before we move on to Prism Central, I do want to briefly show you our lifecycle management. This is where we do things like updates of both software as well as firmware. So in this case, there's going to be a hypervisor that's running. There's going to be our software they call Acropolis operating system, as well as the Acropolis hypervisor, and various other things that could be running on the cluster. And this is how I would automatically update all of the software on the cluster, as well as the ability to upgrade the firmware, right? So disk drive firmware, et cetera. And then we have the ability to show you best practices. We have the ability to inventory, perform an inventory, and do downloads automatically of the latest firmware, and downloads automatically from the internet from our support portal of the latest software. So obviously, if you're a dark site, black site, that's not going to be applicable, but as long as you have network connectivity, and as long as the cluster itself can reach out to the Nutanix support portal, we can set up the cluster to be able to automatically download updates for you, and download not just software updates, but firmware updates. And then it's up to you when you decide to perform those updates. So just because we downloaded an update doesn't mean that we're actually going to run it. And before we run it, we have some pre-upgrade checks that we would recommend you run. So we support upgrading multiple different types of hypervisors, not just our own. So if you're running VMware ESXi on Nutanix, we can also run an hypervisor upgrade from here as well. So we also can run we can also run LCM Lifecycle Manager, not only from this main console, but also from Prism Central centrally. And I will show you that in just a few minutes. So before we do that, going to Prism Central, again, emphasizing here now managing multiple things from a central pane of glass, again, from a hardware perspective, looking at all the various different hosts. So these are all the hosts across multiple different clusters and multiple geographic locations that could be running multiple different types of hypervisors. In my lab environment, I set everything up with one. So looking at not just the host, but I can look at the clusters. There's the various different clusters. There's obviously drill down capability, to look at the cluster itself. There's the capability to look at the host that I just did, as well as the ability to look at those storage containers, or even create a new storage container and choose, for example, what cluster do you want to create that storage container on? What settings do you want, like compression, deduplication, et cetera, right? So from a central pane of glass, keep in mind what we're doing is we're collapsing and eliminating, we're collapsing multiple components and eliminating complexity. For example, here with Prism Central, we are managing the compute, we're managing the storage, we're managing the hypervisor, in our case, Acropolis hypervisor. So unlike a customer who might be a compute Dell shop, who might be a storage, for example, NetApp shop, maybe a hypervisor, maybe they're running VMware vSphere, and maybe they're even running VMware's NSX for microsegmentation, they would have multiple consoles, multiple products to purchase, multiple products to coordinate the installation, multiple products to coordinate upgrades, and multiple products to go through in a troubleshooting scenario that could often lead to finger pointing. And one of the things that's very nice about Prism Central, it's a single solution to purchase, a single solution to install. It's all tightly integrated. It provides upgrades of all the pieces that you need of the compute, the storage, the software, the firmware, everything from a central pane of glass, and reduces complexity and reduces finger pointing in the case of troubleshooting. So now what I'd like to do from a central pane of glass is scroll up here and show you centrally managing virtual machines. And if I take off my filter here, again, you can see all of the different VMs that I have. These VMs in this particular cluster are in Durham, North Carolina. They could be anywhere, but that's where my lab is located. And I'm running out of remotely out of Southern Maryland today. And so when I think about all these different VMs, if I click on my search field here and I type in my name, I can see all the VMs that have the name Simon in them, my name. And so the first thing that I want to do is show you that even from a central pane of glass, Prism Central, we have that ability to do things like launch the console that I showed you earlier. Obviously, you can RDP. You can do obviously other actions like update the config centrally, changing the virtual CPU, adding virtual disk, doing whatever you might need to do to update an existing VM. You might even want to migrate that VM. So for example, if I click on this guy here, we can see that it's currently on the 04 host, right? So if I go back to this guy and I say migrate, where's my migrate? Right here. I'm going to choose migrate, but instead of it being on 4, maybe I'll move it to host 1 and click migrate. And then of course we get a task that's running. I can look at the task and I can see that task is running. And once that task is finalized, I can go to the list of VMs and type in my name. I can see this particular VM and I can see that it's on cluster 01, but what node is it on? If I click in here, it's already on node 1. So we migrated that. So very similar to a VMware vMotion activity in which you're live migrating a VM. And as you saw me log into the console, that could have very well been a SQL database running queries and doing a live migration from one AHV, Nutanix HV host, to another. The other thing that you might want to do, and we mentioned doing cloning, right? So even from a central pane of glass, regardless of the cluster, we might want to do a clone. And I might want to, again, call this clone. And I might want to do, 5 VMs, starting index number 1. I could obviously change the virtual settings for CPU memory and storage, or anything else that I might need to do. I can do some customization if I wanted to, or from the central pane of glass, I can go ahead and clone that guy. And so it's running, and I can see if I refresh my screen here a little bit, so I'm going to go summary, come back. All right, now we see, I'm going to deselect this one. We see all the different ones that got automatically labeled clone. Obviously, I could choose actions, such as I could power them all on, I could power them all off, or I could decide to delete them. Lots of things that I can do centrally, as well as doing things like managing the Nutanix guest tools. The guest tools from Nutanix, similar to guest tools from VMware, ours have some other features and capabilities, such as giving the user self-service restore. If it's like a desktop type Windows operating system, because we take snapshots of the VM, so we can allow the user to restore their own files from a snapshot. But more importantly, one of the nice features we do that's more on the operating server side would be cross-hypervisor replication. So the ability to replicate VMs from, say, a Nutanix cluster running VMware ESXi to another Nutanix cluster running our Acropolis HV hypervisor. So we refer to that as cross-hypervisor replication. In order to facilitate cross-hypervisor replication, we install Nutanix guest tools. And when we manage the guest tools, that allows us to do things like apply the cross-hypervisor replication or the self-service for the restore capability. But for now, since I don't need these VMs, I'm going to go ahead and just choose all of them and hit delete. One of the nice things about Prism Central is the ability to centrally manage regardless of where these things are located. So these VMs could have been located East Coast, West Coast in the United States. In my case, they're in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm remotely accessing them from Maryland. So very nice to do that all centrally, quite frankly. Now, what I'd like to do is get into some of the automation of disaster recovery for you guys and show you our capabilities. So we have this entity that we call a protection policy. And inside a protection policy, call it whatever you want, have the ability to choose a source and a destination. And we're using terminology like the cloud, like availability zone. So my local availability zone is my first cluster. This is my source cluster. And then, of course, I have my destination cluster over here. So I'm replicating from NFIL1 to NFIL02, and I'm taking recovery points along the way. And I'm setting up my RPO of every 15 minutes on both sides. And in here, the way that I choose the type of VMs, we use something called categories. And we have all these different categories that are available. And I'm going to search for ENV for the word environment. And so we have these environment staging, testing, prod, dev, etc. And in here, I'm going to hit cancel for a sec. I've already used the one that we call environment production. And in that environment, we have all these VMs that I've added. All these VMs begin with PC. I called them PC because they are managed by Prism Central, as opposed to what I showed you earlier. So these VMs are not being managed by that protection domain that I showed you earlier. This feature has a lot more automation for disaster recovery to fail over, right? And so we use the category, we put the VMs in the category, and we apply that category to this protection policy. I'm going to cancel out because I don't need to make any modifications to this policy. And then I'm going to show you our recovery plan. And we can have more than one recovery plan. And one of the things that I might want to do is validate, do a failover, test, or even if I show you update here. So again, this is where I'm replicating from NFIL cluster 1 to NFIL 2. What type of failover do I want to do? Here's the VMs that are included. This is the network mapping. We can support multiple network VLANs for both the production network as well as the test network. So whenever you're doing disaster recovery testing, you want to be able to test it, but maybe fail over and fail back on a test subnet, test VLAN, as opposed to using your production, right? Now, in my case, in my lab, I have everything on the same VLAN. So I have to give it the default gateway, subnet mask information, and the name of my actual VLANs. In my case, I called it primary for everything. I have not separated out the test versus production, but you would do that in a real environment. And so I'm going to cancel out of this, cancel out of this. And so when we have a recovery plan, let me show you, if I go back to this main console and I look at the VMs here, and if I search in here for the VMs that begin with PC, right? These are all the VMs that are on this source cluster that we call NFIL 001. And if I look at this second cluster, the one I'm going to call my target cluster, if I look for any VMs that currently begin with PC, there are none, right? So I'll even remove that search, and I can show you that this is in alphabetical order. Oracle and OR, there's no VM that begins with P on the secondary cluster. They're all over here. I forget how many there are. I think there's like 10 VMs. So if I come over here to Prism Central and I choose my recovery plan and I say failover, right? By the way, first, I'm going to do this cleanup action because I don't remember if I did this before. Every time you're doing a test or if you're doing any kind of failover, failback, you always want to do a cleanup, because what we do when we do a test is we actually create new VMs and put them on that test subnet. We want to make sure that we clean them up if we've ever done a test before we do something else. So I just did that just to make sure it's a good best practice. And then what I want to do is my failover, right? So I'm going to choose that I want to failover from cluster 1 to cluster 2. And I've got my 10 VMs and I'm using my local AZ. Now I have a couple of different options. Either I'm going to choose this, a planned failover, which what we'll do as automation is we will take a snapshot, we'll power off the VMs on the production side, and then we'll replicate them to the secondary target and we'll power them on the target. Now, if we had a crash in the data center and we were not able to access the data center, we might need to do an unplanned failover. So we might use that one. But for today, I'm going to do the planned, and I'm not going to do the live migrate. I'm just going to do this, and this is going to involve downtime on the production side. It's going to automatically down them and up them on the secondary side. So when I click failover, this is my "Are you sure?" screen. I'm going to type in failover. It's going to say yes, I'm sure. It's going to go ahead and proceed. It's going to create some tasks. And while that's running, now I can see the recovery plan. You can see that it's spinning. You can see that it's running. If I click on it here and I look at the tasks, I can see that it's in the running stage at this point, right? So it has not completed. Now, if I come over here to my primary cluster, and if I refresh the screen a couple of times, it may take a couple of times, you will start to see these VMs start to get powered off. And then on the other cluster, you'll start to see these VMs come in to this cluster here. So it hasn't happened yet. Let me go ahead and keep doing that. It takes just a second, and I'm always very impatient, but here they are. So now you're seeing the behavior where on this primary cluster, NFIL 001, those source VMs are powered off. The snapshots have been taken. They're replicating to the secondary cluster. If I go ahead and click over here, I don't see them on this cluster yet. Oh, now they're coming over. So I'm starting to see these VMs, so I can actually search for any VM that begins with PC. Let me give them a little mouse in there. There they go. So they're over here on the destination cluster, but they're not powered on yet. And if I go back to the source, you see the only VM that begins with PC is not those primary ones, it's the one that we cloned earlier, one of the ones that I cloned earlier. And so now these VMs that are over here have not been powered on yet. I'm just going to keep refreshing the screen until they're powered on. But if I come back to this screen where Prism Central is, where we off the task, I can see that it now thinks that the job is successful on all of those VMs. So now if I go back here and I refresh the screen, I should see, yep, all of those VMs are now powered on. They're on the secondary site, and I can do things like launch the console on one of them, for example, just to make sure that the Windows operating system is indeed starting up or what have you, right? And so now we just showed you automation of not only protecting your VMs based on the schedule that you want, the snapshot schedule that you want, in my case, every 15 minutes, but also the ability to automatically declare an incident, fail back. And then one of the things that I will show you here in a second is the capability to report on all of this and show you how things are going. So let me do that. If I go into Prism Central, I close out of this screen, and I go to where the reports are within Prism Central, we have various different panned reports, as well as the ability to create a new report, create custom reports. I'll just briefly show you some of these. We have an environment summary report. You can run it as often as you want. It'll create a PDF, and the PDF can be automatically run and emailed to other people. It shows you what's going on in the environment, the Prism Central, the version, information about the cluster itself, how many clusters in the environment, how many hosts, how many VMs, A lot of information about the actual host themselves, what hypervisor, even the version of the hypervisor details, details on utilization for the clusters for CPU, memory, and storage, any savings from compression, versions of the software that's currently being used, as well as resource utilization from minimums, average, and peaks, and even looking at the environment over time with graphs. So again, very useful information from an environmental perspective. And then another really useful report is this cluster efficiency report. A lot of people really like this one. And again, keep in mind, this can be automated to run and automated to be emailed to various different people, managers, et cetera. So show me the efficiency of the host, the VMs, the cluster runway. Is anything inactive? Is anything over provisioned? Do I have any issues with memory, any issues with CPU? Again, looking at utilization, looking at peaks for CPU, peaks for memory, peaks for storage, looking at inactive VMs, over provisioned VMs, constrained VMs, et cetera, if I have any environment. So you can see a ton of information from a efficiency perspective. So if I close this screen and finally just show you that last one, which is data protection and recovery, might be useful to show managers as far as your disaster recovery plan that you are testing your DR, how many entities are protected. You've got 10 VMs protected. How many times did you perform an operation like a test or a planned failover? Did that plan fail or did it succeed? What VMs were included in the plan? What was your RPO? And so on and so forth, information about, what, when, where, and how the disaster recovery, either the testing or the actual failover that you might need to do took place, right? So a lot of good information from a reporting perspective. And then in addition to that, the environment can change over time. And this is the environment today. As far as CPU, memory, and storage, you have plenty of runway. You're not going to run out of compute or storage for a year. But what if you were to take your existing cluster and in some period in time from now, maybe you wanted to add a workload. It could be any workload, a VM, SQL, VDI, Splunk, whatever. But let's say it's something weird like 1,000 large OLAP databases that are mission critical. And you'll notice that everything turns red, that you would run out of CPU and memory and storage. So we have the ability to add additional nodes to the environment, different node types with different configurations for CPU, memory, and storage, and be able to pre-plan. So the idea here is to tell you when you're going to run out of space, even based on future workloads that may not even exist yet, but you're planning to add to the environment. And then, of course, you can generate a PDF and send that out for planning purposes, so that if you did need to add new nodes to the system, you would know when to do that. And in addition, we have a capacity runway report, which would show you, and again, normally you would see a graph here for both storage, CPU, and memory. I don't have a lot going on here because this is a lab server that I only just created a couple of days ago, and I haven't installed a lot of VM data, and I haven't had a lot of time. But the idea here is that this would show you capacity over time. So you'd start to get a more graphic of when you're running out of time, when you're running out of resources, right? So we've covered the reports, the planning, the dashboards, and finally, one of the things from Prism Central that I do want to show you is centrally here running our, our Lifecycle Manager from Prism Central. And again, I can take an inventory of what's going on in the environment. This is from a Prism Central perspective of the different AOSs that I have, the different types of Nutanix software, the Prism Central itself, and I can actually perform the updates here of the software that Prism Central is taking care of. And so now one of the things that I would like to do is if we can go back to this recovery plan, and all of these VMs are currently on my, what I'll call cluster 2, they're not on the cluster 1. We're actually going to do a failback, and then we'll end this demo here. So I'm going to go ahead and say, actually, I didn't do my cleanup yet, did I? So I'm just going to say cleanup, just in case there's any leftover things that is the best practice we're always told to do. And it says it was initialized. I'm sure that's going to be good by now. So I'm going to go ahead and click failover. But in this case, I'm going to go from cluster 2 to cluster 1. And we're using those 10 VMs. and we're going to do the planned failover. We're not going to do the live. We're not going to do the unplanned. So we're going from cluster 2 to cluster 1. Click failover. It's going to say, are you sure? And we say failover. And we may need to wait a few minutes, refresh the screen. And after this is done and you see this, we'll be wrapping up this demonstration for the day. So I can click on this guy and I can look at the tasks. I can look at the failover and I can see that it's running. And again, if I go to this environment and I start to refresh my screen here, we should start to see, as you saw before, I'm on cluster number 2. We should start to see these VMs, right, getting powered off on this cluster in a few minutes, obviously. It takes a little bit of time, so I can come back to Prism Central. I can be impatient and try to refresh here. It doesn't say that it succeeded 100% yet, but it has succeeded validating the plan. Now it's just trying to run. But if I go back to 2 and I refresh the screen a little bit, well, let's go back to 1 and see if anything is here. I'm still looking for VMs that say PC. Not yet. Come back over here. There we go. So now all these VMs are powered off on cluster number 2, and they're being snapshot and replicated over back to cluster 1. So if I come over here and start to refresh, at some point in time here, I'll probably see these VMs come over here. It's going to take a little bit of time. In this case, all of the nodes in both clusters are in the same data center. So you can see the VMs are now gone from cluster number 2. I'll remove that filter so that you can see that none of the VMs that begin with PC are on cluster number 2. And if I come over here, you start to see them getting built on cluster number 1. So again, in my lab environment, both clusters are in the same data center, so my replication doesn't have a whole lot of latency. Obviously, if you're replicating from East Coast to West Coast, you can have latency. Things are going to take more time, but I've set this up just for the sake of making sure that the demo would go as quickly as I possibly could in the same data center. We do have other data centers on the West Coast, like in Phoenix. So if anybody wants to see a more detailed one with actual latency going across the country, we'd be more than glad to set that up for you. But for now, this is the idea and this is the behavior. And so now everything is back to square one. And if we come back here, we see that our protection recovery plan has succeeded successfully. So we did a failover and we did a failback. And hopefully you've learned quite a bit about Nutanix today. This is just a high level scratching the surface, but I think the technology is very easy to adopt, easy to use. Golly, if I can understand and learn it, I'm sure you can too. Thank you for your time today. Again, my name is Simon Mature, and I am a Nutanix SE. Thank you very much.